and Mr. Wilson will be taking down names, so please signal to him if you wish to be called upon. And again, bear in mind with this study that essentially what it's doing is just giving us a look at what changes have occurred in our discipline practices, and just a survey of the data itself. But I'm now going to turn it over to Mr. Smith and his team to introduce everyone who's joined us up here, and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. And I appreciate your guidance to the board around how we look at the data today. It's a very different report, and I know that Dr. Sockwell will get into that as part of the presentation, but it's a very different report than the board has seen, and that you will continue to receive your regular reports from the hearings office and information related to SR&R. We know that we have a meeting coming up in May that's solely focused on SR&R. So again, this is a look back over time. And this is the third in a series of reports that are coming to the board from the Office of Program Evaluation, with our final report being the early childhood report. We have with us today Dr. Ricardo Sockwell, who is the director of the Office of Program Evaluation. Lydia Haruda is here with us as well. She is our manager within that office. And while we know that this is a look back at data over time, we know that the board often has questions about certain content-related areas that the team cannot answer. So we've asked Marianne Panarelli and Dana Scanlon to sit at the table today with us. They will not be part of the presentation, but again, we know that we may have answers or questions that they would be most well suited to answer. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Sockwell.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. As Mr. Smith said, this is a report that looks back over a decade at some of the changes that we have seen in our discipline regulation and practices, as well as some of the associated outcomes. But to start this, one of the topics that we're going to discuss in this report is on disproportionality. I want to call your attention to this special note that defines the scope and parameters for the use of this term in an interpretation of this term in the report itself. The statement is also in the full report. Okay. So in terms of the purpose of the presentation for the school board today, we have three purposes. One is to present the findings from the study. The second one is to talk about some implications. So what does it mean now that we have found certain issues or successes or areas of concern? What does it mean for moving forward? And then lastly, what are recommendations? How do we actually define the steps that we think need to be taken? Now, these recommendations are both the result of the findings as well as the general research in this area and expert opinions. And so those are the basis for the recommendations that we're going to provide. Mr. Smith alluded to this, but I want to deal with this in a little more detail. This report is different from most other reports you will see on discipline. One, it is not designated to provide the level of data that you're going to see from Marianne or Dana or even from DIT, where you have very specific details that probably are beyond the scope of a 12-year look. And this is a look across time. And so as you look across time, as you can imagine, we made lots of decisions about what to show you and what to talk about when you have to cover that scope of time. We use data to answer specific questions about outcomes that are associated with discipline practices. And so we're not just presenting data. We try to determine the kinds of questions from discussions with Mr. Smith, with an evaluation team, with looking at the research. We try to determine what questions will be most relevant to try to approach in this kind of look. So it does not answer all questions. And lastly, we provide recommendations for continuous improvement. So this is not an evaluation because this is not a program, and we deal with middle and high school data only in this report. We believe this study is a natural outgrowth of several issues. One, FCPS has a general practice of updating its discipline regulation and practices based on changing conditions and needs and outcomes. So that's not new to the school division. But there are also these emerging local and national trends, and I would say in terms of discipline, they are always emerging. And so it's always a good idea to take a look at what you're doing to see how it aligns with best practices. And then lastly, we have recently included in our strategic plan language around fostering a responsive, caring, and inclusive culture where all feel valued, supported, and hopeful. In this context, we believe this report would have special meaning to the school board. So what questions did we attempt to answer in this report? First, and maybe the biggest question, is what kinds of changes have taken place over the last decade or last 12 years? And then what kinds of improvements were expected from these changes? Secondly, did we see the outcomes that we were targeting? Did we get out of this what we thought we were going to get out of it? And then lastly, what additional improvements do we think can be made to the way in which we do discipline in Fairfax County Public Schools? And this is based on staff comments. By the way, I will say this so there's just no confusion. We looked at changes and then outcomes that tend to be associated with those changes that concurred. So as we see changes, what kinds of outcomes that we see, we're not arguing a cause-effect relationship here, only that they coexist, okay? So in terms of the findings, this first big question, how have FCPS's code of conduct and discipline practices changed over the last 12 years and what improvements were expected? I'm going to next describe to you the findings and then the evidence that we used to determine that finding. And these findings are about what changes, not yet what impacts. That's coming later. And you're going to notice that we have divided this 12-year period into an early first half of the decade and then a later period, or the second half of the decade. This is based on our observations of when we thought we saw some big shifts. I will say that's subject to interpretation, but it was our best judgment to cut the period the way we did. So this first finding, if you look to the left of the slide, finding one, the goal of the early years. The goal seemed to have been focused mostly on continuous improvement to school orderliness and safety. That seemed to have been a very compelling goal during this period of time. Now, what evidence do we have that something occurred? When we looked at the documents and even talked to staff, and this is an example, this is not the only evidence, but there was a prohibition of certain kinds of clothing that could promote violence or in which weapons could be hidden. It could have been at the time a concern about gang participation or other things. But this first period probably is not the most exciting one to talk about, and so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. I'd rather call your attention to this next second half of the decade. And by the way, in your report is a listing, a table that lists all the changes that we documented over time. And so I'm highlighting those, but you can refer to that table for more details. The goal of the last 6 years, 2010-11 through 15-16, the goals seem to have been focused on four major areas. One, maintaining orderliness and safety. We didn't give up on that goal in the second half of the decade. We expanded it. We also were concerned about reducing suspensions and referrals to the hearing office, reducing disproportionality, and also reducing disruptions or interruptions to instruction that are associated with discipline. So I'm going to talk about examples under each one of these 4 areas as evidence that some changes did occur. Under maintaining orderliness and safety, we again improved, and we continue to do this, but we improved the clarity and understanding of the SR&R. And there are a lot of ways in which that was done, but that was the big area that we worked on under this. We also expanded restorative justice training across the division as a way of maintaining orderliness and safety. The second big goal area that I talked about was reducing suspensions and referrals to the hearing office. The examples or the highlights that I provide are, one, we created alternatives to suspensions themselves with the positive behavior and other kinds of approaches, as well as in-school suspensions. And then we also eliminated mandatory out-of-school suspensions, including that 10-day period when a student is referred to the hearing office. The other large areas of change had to do with reducing disproportionality, and we're going to talk a lot more about this later, but we added a records review by regional assistant superintendents, and so that they could monitor the recommendations that were coming directly from schools to see if there were alternative ways of addressing issues with students. We also began providing disaggregated data to high schools, and this is just to high schools, but giving them more disciplined data so that they can actually see patterns in their own students. The last big area was reducing interruptions to instruction. Here, and the major actions that I'm highlighting included adjusting the hearing office process to reduce the length of time students were suspended and missing time in school. We also added the out-of-school support program such that even when a student was out of school, they could continue to get some kind of instructional support or academic support. And then we also implemented the system of support advisors, the SOSAs, at each one of the high schools. So these are some of the major changes that we've charted over time. Now, next, Lydia is going to talk about, so if we did these changes, what were the impacts or what were the results?
Okay, so as Ricardo mentioned, I am going to talk about both of the periods that he described, as well as each of the goals that were relevant during the period, and talk about the outcomes that we saw that coincided with those goals. And as I'm talking about the data, if you want more information about the data sources that were used for each of the graphics or data that I talk about, that's available for you at the end of the PowerPoint. So the first goal that was mentioned was the one around orderliness and safety. And if we had been successful in terms of orderliness and safety, you would see things like lower rates of offenses occurring and lower rates of recidivism. So let's take a look at what the data looked like. The finding for that first period, we found that during the first part of the period, when FCPS was focused on trying to improve safety, we saw a decrease in some offenses in the alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, or ATOD offenses, in assaults and in weapons. But we saw at the same time that other offenses increased substantially. And by other offenses, we mean things that don't fall into any of the other 3 categories. This is a framework that's typically used in FCPS, and it includes everything else that isn't included in one of the high interest ones of the ATOD, the assaults, or the weapons. During the second period, what we found was that as we shifted over to the more proactive kinds of approaches that the school division was using, that generally we maintained or even improved safety during that time. And now I'm going to show you the data that goes along with that to support those findings. First, on this slide, the slides in all of these cases are color-coded. The blue periods are the areas that Ricardo was talking about when he talked about the first period in the first part of those 12 years, and the yellow is the second part of the 12 years. And our comparisons for looking at this to try to look at the shifts was always to look at the very last year before the period began and then the last year of data that we have in the period. So in this case, you'll see that for alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, you saw I'll try to show it. So you saw a shift from a higher rate of offenses prior to the period right to a lower rate of offenses towards the end of the period in that blue period. And then you'll see similar drops in the assaults and the weapons as well. While for other offenses, you'll see that they go up and then they drop back down, but they still end up higher than they started at the beginning prior to the blue period starting. So the number of serious offenses declined while the other offenses increased. Now you can also see on this slide that the second period and the yellow period, you saw pretty much a maintenance of some of the offenses in some of the categories, and then simultaneously a decrease in the other offenses. Now because other offenses on these graphs are on a different scale, the scale ranges from 0 to 14,000, while the range for the alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, assaults and weapons is from 0 to 800, just so that you can see it clearly. The other offenses, because there's so many of them, their shifts really change what the overall shifts are like. So as they increased, the overall offenses increased. When they decreased in the yellow period, the overall offenses decreased. And this slide gives you more detailed information if you want the specific numbers for each of those years. So moving on to recidivism, and for this study we define recidivism as whether or not a student committed another VDOE reported offense within the same school year. And this slide shows it broken out by the different kinds of consequences that students received. So whether they received a referral to the hearings office, an out-of-school suspension, or some other consequence, which can vary greatly from having your parents called in to attending an alcohol seminar or many other kinds of consequences. So within year recidivism, decreased for suspended students and increased for students with other consequences. So the suspended and referral students both saw a decrease from before the period to the very end of the yellow period, while the other students who were receiving other consequences saw some increase over time. And here again is a data table if you want the specific numbers. The final set of data that we looked at in terms of school safety was around youth survey data and students' own perceptions of whether they felt safe at school. And you'll see that during this period, it was relatively flat but high. So our students typically report feeling quite safe at school, and that didn't really change during this time at all. And again, here are the data, the number of students who participated in that survey each year. The second goal that we looked at, and this was a goal that was only something we pursued in the second part, or the last 5 or 6 years, was around reducing suspensions and referrals to the hearings office. And again, here, if we had been successful, you would see decreases in those referrals and suspensions. And what we found was that they did in fact decrease. Out-of-school suspensions decreased by half, and referrals to the hearings office decreased by a fourth since 2009-10. And here's the data slides that go with that. You'll see that we started out with almost 6,000 right before we started trying to decrease them. And then by the end of, or the last year of data that we have that's recent, we're well under 3,000 at that point, so it decreased by half. In terms of referrals to the hearings office, you also see a decrease. It's not quite as steep, but you see a drop from almost 600 to about 400 during this time. The third goal that we looked at, again, only during the second period, was around reducing disproportionality. And here, if we had been successful in doing this, what you would see is that students from different subgroups would be being suspended at approximately equal rates. Now, in this case, the finding for disproportionality was that FCPS demonstrates lower rates of suspension for ethnic and disability subgroups in comparison to the nation, state, and other school divisions. And here's the data evidence for that. You'll see on this chart that the red hash mark, which represents FCPS's suspension rates, typically is at the very low end of each of the columns. So for each of the subgroups, we're at the very low end of suspension rates when we compare ourselves. And the blue triangle represents what is happening at the state, so the average for the state, while the black square represents a national average. And you can see that FCPS is always lower than any of those. The vertical line that's on this represents other Virginia school divisions. And again, you can see that we are either the lowest school division or at the very low end of it. And what you can also see on this slide, however, is that disproportionality does exist. We have, for example, 1% of our Asian students being suspended in the year that was looked at here, while 4% of our Black students were being suspended. So you still see that 4 times as many Black students being suspended in these data. And again, here's the data slide with all the values should you want to look at it. Another finding when it came to disproportionality was while we've made improvements in disproportionality over the last 5 years or so, for students with disabilities and with our Black students, the same was not the case for our Hispanic students. And this data slide shows the evidence for that. Let me talk a little bit about how to understand these slides. The slides here show what's called a likelihood ratio. So it's basically how likely are you for your subgroup to be suspended compared to other students in FCPS. If there was no disproportionality between the groups, everybody would be at 1 at all the years and lined up at 1. So when you're above the line for 1, that means you're disproportionately represented or overrepresented. When you're below the line, you're underrepresented. So for example, that value of 2 over there for our Hispanic students means that in school year 2009-10, they were twice as likely to be suspended as other students in the school division. And the value below that of 0.5 is for our Asian students, and that means they were half as likely as other students in the school division to be suspended. You'll see that over time, those shift a little bit. When we compare the 09-10 values to the 14-15 values, you'll see that our Black students are being suspended at approximately equal disproportional rates, while our Hispanic students have increased. But in talking to staff, they think that they conveyed to us that specific efforts had been made over the last 2 years to decrease disproportionality, and so they recommended that the 13-14 data be compared to the 14-15 data. And when you look at it from that perspective, the 3.4 disproportionality of Blacks that you saw in 13-14 did in fact decrease the subsequent year, but you see the reverse happening for our Hispanic students. On the next slide, you'll see the similar kinds of data for our students with disabilities in comparison to our students who are not in that category. And again, you see quite large disproportional rates in comparison. So disproportionality, however, did decline from 2013 to 2014-15, but in comparison to where it was in 2009-10, it had increased. Now, I want to just point out to you, these data here in this table are the ones that were used to calculate it. It's not a direct calculation. You have to use a formula to do it. So you can't get easily from this to that, but there is a description in the paper on how to do it. But I did want to point out that these disproportionality rates that I was talking about doesn't mean that the overall number of suspensions weren't going down. For example, if you look at the rates for our not for our students with disabilities in 2013-14, and if you recall here, that was our highest year for them. That year was actually the 932 for those students in that year who were suspended is actually lower than the prior year, the 1,082. So it does not mean that our suspensions were not going down simultaneously. It just reflects the fact that the proportions and how of each of the subgroups differed from year to year in terms of what was happening. Now, the final goal that we looked at was around whether or not FCPS had reduced interruptions to instruction. And for this outcome, we were looking specifically if we had been successful at looking for fewer expulsions. We were looking for less days out of school when you're suspended. And then lastly, looking to see whether more students were able to be returned to their base school. So the finding here was that the efforts to reduce interruptions to instruction really did yield significant improvements over time. And here's the data for that. The first bit is around the expulsions, and you'll see a huge drop from the 131 that had been expelled previously, before we started focusing on trying to reduce that, to the 2 that were expelled last year. And this includes students who were expelled with and without services. The next slide is the number of days suspended, the median number of days, and this dropped from the 21 down to 7. So again, you see quite a large drop in that. And then lastly is the percent of students who were allowed to return to their attending school, and that rose considerably from 5% to 38%. Which means prior to this period, 95% of the students going through the hearings process were required to change schools after the hearing. Now, 62% of our students are being required to change schools, so it's been quite a change. And again, here are the data if you want to know the specific numbers related to that. So in summary, when you look at the goals that FCPS set out for itself over this time, many of them showed positive outcomes related to them. The improving of the orderliness and safety in the early years seemed positive, and then in the last 6 years, maintaining that orderliness, reducing the number of suspensions and referrals, and reducing interruptions to instruction all seem to be associated with positive outcomes. The one place that we are still looking to see improvements is around reducing disproportionality, and I will now turn it back over to Ricardo.
Thank you. One of our goals in doing this study was to try to discern what additional kinds of changes would make sense once we have gathered all the data. To answer this question, we surveyed middle and high school administrative teams, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what they said, but I want to also put it in a context. The recommendations are based on a survey of staff, and so there may be many things that they did not say and didn't fill in the gaps for us. And also, just because people say there are additional things we ought to do, doesn't mean it's not happening some places. It may just mean it's not happening to their knowledge or in their particular environments. And so please have it in context. So school administrators suggested additional staffing to prevent or intervene early and to provide alternatives to suspensions. And I have a few of the comments from the group here also, one being to expand the number of system support advisors, the SOSAs, and also to ensure sufficient mental health staffing at our schools. Another suggestion was from school administrators was that we should continue to focus on training. And I don't want to read this whole list to you, but all these have to do with training. They have to do with training making sure that all school-based staff are trained, making sure that people are trained in this tiered support system, making sure that people are trained in cultural competency and understand how to discipline students with disabilities, more training in classroom management for those teachers who need it, and then lastly, more training in restorative justice for school-based administrators. So we've talked about the changes that we've seen, the impacts from those changes, and even some additional areas that staff believe we should consider. So what ultimately are the implications and recommendations? These are grouped by the four major areas that we started out describing. The first one being expanding safe, inclusive, and positive school climates. What are the implications under this area? FCPS has identified and implemented effective positive behavior and tiered support initiatives. From the data that we see and the comments that we hear, we believe that there are positive behavior and tiered support initiatives in place. However, sustaining these new policies, practices, and programs will require some ongoing and deliberate professional development. And by deliberate, we mean it's going to have to be very targeted to what people say they need in these areas. Also, under expanding safe school climates, determining the adequacy of the current school-based personnel allocation will require some additional study. That was beyond the scope of our study, so we can't speak to that either way without additional data. Expanding two-way communications between schools and families will be critical to maintaining and improving school climate. And by this we mean at the school level, making sure that families and students are part of that understanding and discussion about discipline practices and outcomes at the school level, and even the suggesting different directions as a part of that team. Under reducing disproportionality, connecting disproportionality concerns to the relevant strategic plan actions may be a very powerful mechanism for maintaining focus in this area. And expanding current discipline data to permit or allow school-based monitoring of discipline conditions is also considered a very important next step. Under supporting academic achievement of disciplined students, the implication we saw was that these shifts in the discipline practices have put Fairfax County on the cutting edge of many of the recommended practices that we see in the literature. Not all of them, but many of the practices that we are using really are on the cutting edge of what's in the literature. And the last observation here is assessing the academic impact of these changes over the last 2 years in which we have used the SOSAs. That will require additional study also. We simply don't have the data to make any comments about the academic impact of the SOSAs at this point. So the recommendations first to the superintendent. We recommend expanding access for all schools to information that supports their ability to make effective and consistent decisions about discipline at their schools. That is, expanding the database and access. Also expanding the professional development to include training on how to reduce disproportionality for school-based administrators and instructional staff, we believe is an important next step. And then lastly, requiring all schools to consider discipline and disproportionality data in their school improvement planning process, we believe it will be critical as well. To the school board, from what we gather from the data and the outcomes, maintaining the general direction of the current discipline policy seems prudent, as well as supporting the direction of the current discipline regulations and practices. We're headed in the right direction. And when we say direction, we don't mean you don't change anything. It means that we think we are headed in the right direction. And so staying within that zone of where you are now probably will give you some consistent outcomes over time. The last big area, though, has to do with disproportionality. requiring disproportionality data to be a part of the strategic plan reporting to guide the school board's feedback to the superintendent about discipline practices, we also believe is critical at this point. That's our report.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It really is a wealth of information, and I think a lot of great news on what you were showing in terms of where we've seen some drops, but also I imagine my colleagues will be talking about where we have, continued concerns. I'm sure reflects Dr. Garza and her administration's desire as well to continue the improvements that we hope to see for all students. So with that, we've got quite an extensive list. We'll begin with Ms. Hines, followed by Ms. Evans, followed by Ms. Huff.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is very helpful. I like the focus on, there's a lot of good news, really a lot of good news. And I like the focus on disproportionality, though. And even there's good news. And when we benchmark against nationally and other systems in Virginia, there's good news. But we're not there. I agree with you. So it's something, and I like the recommendation to the school board to continue to request that we keep an eye on that in reports that we get. I had a few questions that I'm sorry I didn't get to you before today. So if any of them can be answered today, that's great. Those that can't, I'll email and maybe get an answer later. But maybe I'll just run through the questions and then you can answer what you can. I noticed that you're basing some of this on data that the school system reports to OCR. And I just wondered if it's possible, and I know there's a whole lot of data that the school system reports to OCR, and I've never asked this question before. Can the school board get all of that data? We have an annual report to OCR, I think, and so I'm wondering if the school board can get that data. Another thing was, can we get the discipline data disaggregated by race and academic track? And by that I mean if we see that our Black and Hispanic students who are in honors or APIB are less likely to be disciplined. I think that's just interesting data that we ought to have. Also, kind of where are we on cultural competency training? How many have been trained, and what's the rollout look like for that? Almost done. I really like on page 22 of the report the idea of collaborative groups of students and teachers at each school to make improvements. I think that sounded like a great idea. And then finally, I had a question about the disproportionality disclaimer that you started with. And what it says is that a disproportionate effect does not equal unlawful discrimination, right? That's not the only evidence that we need to show that we're, not obeying the law. I'm wondering if the outcome is disproportional, what else needs to be, what other factors go into a decision about whether or not we are staying within the law? So
I think that if you give us some time to answer your questions, Ms. Hines, we'll get back with you on that. We'd like to talk with legal to specifically answer that final question for you.
And Mr. Smith, I would just request, Chairman Hines, that as we're probably going to be collecting questions along the way, that then you would prepare something to send to the full board so we all benefit. Ms. Hines, anything else? Dr. Sockwell, did you want to add something there?
No, Mr. Smith added it.
Okay, great. All right. Then we're on to Ms. Evans.
Thank you very much for this detailed report. I did look through it very thoroughly, as well as the previous reports over the weekend, and this is really great news. And I think, first of all, we need to take a step back and look at how this substantiates, beyond a doubt, the work that the school board and the school system did to reform our student discipline policies. This was very important work, and if you look at the out-of-school suspensions, the expulsions, huge difference from before and after. So kudos to everyone who implemented the changes, because these were very significant changes, and To see it so fully embraced is wonderful. I want to say, I think with the recommendations, I was very pleased to see the recommendations. Having more mental health support in our schools is critically important, not just for this, but at all levels across the board. So I was pleased with that. The training pieces, I certainly agree with that. One, you went a little bit light on the parent notification. That was made a huge difference. We made a significant change on parent notification, and I have seen very significant improvement in this area. I do think that we still need more training in terms of making sure that every administrator understands what it means to call the parents as soon as practicable. I think we are very clear that parents are being called before a written statement is requested. I think there's some interpretation on exactly when parents are called in the process, and I do think that we need to be very clear that parents need to be called just as soon as possible. So I look forward to making sure that all of our administrators get training there, and that ties in with the recommendation on two-way communication as well. The more we communicate with parents throughout the process, the better. I did want to pick up on one piece that was kind of fascinating, where it says that the literature recommends no out-of-school suspensions, or referrals or alternative placements, except in a very small subset. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a bit. That would be again a significant change from where we are now, to say no out-of-school suspensions, no referrals to the hearing office, and no alternative placements. I assume that the exceptions would be things like violent acts and that kind of thing. So could you tell us a little bit more about that, and if you're actually making that recommendation to the board?
As you mentioned, the literature does talk about it. It's not necessarily to not have any out-of-school suspensions. The idea is to limit them to only certain types of offenses, and to have that list of offenses be minimal and be known up front. So, for example, school divisions have chosen not to ever suspend for things like disruption, but that there are other things, obviously, like violence, that you would allow suspensions for, but that list be known up front, and that it be as minimal as possible is the idea behind it.
And is the idea then for those things where we now do have some referrals, and of course it's gone way, way down, which is, I think, a great improvement, there would be consequences at the school level? Is that the idea, that a student would stay at the school, but we would have alternative?
Yeah, the idea is, as you said, to not have them be removed from instruction. So it's not that they don't get a consequence for the offense, but that it not be a suspendable offense, so that there be another kind of consequence that hopefully keeps them in school and doesn't disrupt instruction like an out-of-school suspension would.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we have the data or the discussion among staff to say that we're in a position of making that a recommendation to the board at this point.
Okay.
It's an observation of, actually, there are some school divisions that have done this, but we're not in a position of making it a formal recommendation.
Well, that's probably something that we should be pondering very seriously down the road. I know there are those who, when you mentioned disruption, that there are those who feel that there's a disproportionality issue with perception there as well. So thank you. Thank you for an excellent report.
Thank you, Ms. Evans.
I think Mary Ann was going to.
Oh, my apologies.
That's okay. I was just going to say that in the literature around disproportionality is often pointed out that sort of the disrespect, disruption is where one finds the most disproportionality.
Yes.
I would have to say, having attended multiple conferences and had many conversations with sort of my counterparts across the country, that that obviously if you say, well, you can't be suspended for that, then you have really good numbers. It has not necessarily reduced the incidence of that kind of behavior. And schools are struggling to keep that balance
I see.
of
Okay.
safety, respect, your staff feeling, in the Care and Culture report the other day, one of the things was teachers responding when parents or other staff members or youth are disrespectful to them, and you end up with a staff retention problem. So one of the things that has happened across the country, and you see it in the juvenile justice system as well, is as the number of people being put in juvenile detention center, for example, for us, as the number of people being suspended has gone down, the disproportionality has increased. What Luddy was saying before about those numbers where you see the 3.8 and 3,
Right.
the actual number of kids suspended was going down, but the proportion of them who were Black or Hispanic or whatever was increasing. So I don't know that across the country we have come to a solution with that. What we have felt is that when numbers are very small, it is difficult for you as an administrator to recognize that you're being disproportionate. If you suspend 25 kids a year out of your high school, and that's across 6 administrators, it is extremely difficult to see patterns of disproportionality in that practice. So by giving them data, even when it's not yet cleaned up data and it's not pure data and you wouldn't want it to be public data, but saying, here's what your month looked like, the good conversations are beginning and people are beginning to say, wait a minute, let's look at this. And I just feel like we're just at a germinating stage with that, and I would be hesitant to put you absolutely must do X until the schools have an opportunity to work with us and figure it out themselves to some extent.
I take your point on this. We certainly wouldn't want to encourage disrespectful behavior. We would have to deal with this in a very careful and thoughtful way.
All right, thank you. Ms. Huff, followed by Ms. Strauss and then Ms. Schultz.
Thank you. Thanks for the report. I actually had a different question, but given Mary and your comments, I think maybe if I backed up a little, it would help me. So are we talking the disproportionality? I guess I'm not quite sure. Is it a disproportionality in implementation of a discipline for the same incident across races? Or is it a disproportionality in identified behavior? Is it actually disproportionality in behavior?
In terms of numbers, it's simply a disproportionality in terms of the offenses that are being reported. So it's not clear whether it's any of the 3 things that you mentioned. That, I think, needs a different kind of look than what we were taking, which was more just using the data that existed to look at it. I think you'd have to look at it differently to be able to do that. But Mary Ann might be able to speak more to that because they're in the schools looking at it more from that perspective.
I think if you looked at the 4 categories that they used in this report, you get and you just said, well, is any one subgroup being suspended more for weapons, being suspended more? You don't see the disproportionality so much until you get to that other category. The problem with trying to look at it as a whole category is that other is everything else. So other could be wearing gang colors, and other could be tardies. I mean, there's just a whole range of things in there. So again, we felt that our ability to make a good analysis of exactly what was happening at a system level was hampered a little bit. We were getting much better information by having the SOSAs sort of bring the conversation to the administrative team so that they could look at their school. They could see, is it 9th graders? They could see, is it a certain administrator? They could see a lot of things that are difficult from kind of a central level. I'm not even sure, Ms. Hines, that I'm unclear about how we would pull out, kids in honors classes versus the other. We might be able to do that. We'd have to play with it a little bit. But but a school could. You know, at the school level, they would know the kids and they would be more able to do some of that analysis. So again, nationwide, what we see is that it is in the offenses of disrespect, defiance, because a kid has a weapon at school. That's a pretty, they do or they don't, and we're pretty consistent with consequences for you do or you don't. Where it gets more difficult is somebody speaking disrespectfully to somebody, and do you send the kid to the office for that or don't you? You know, I was at a national conference where what they said was that teachers often are referring kids to the office based on whether they feel they can bring the behavior under control themselves. And you feel like you can bring the behavior under control yourself when you have more in common with the person that you're talking to. So, I mean, we look at male-female disproportionality. One of those things is that your teachers are mostly females. And mostly they feel like if a girl is being disrespectful and getting huffy with them, they can bring her back down again and return. They don't feel quite as comfortable about the 6'2" boy. And so they're more likely to say, you go to the office. So there's just so many factors that go into disproportionality that we have to tease all the time.
Okay, thank you. That does help, and I think it's a great conversation. So, with these recommendations, is there a specific goal then with the disproportionality besides that we want to lower it? And I ask that because maybe necessarily it's sounding to me like the goal might not be that we're at that zero line when we looked at above and below, because for that female teacher, that's very real, that a 5'2" girl versus a 6'2" boy might warrant something for that teacher and the classroom safety and disruption. So I don't know if there's a stated set goal here, or if besides reducing, is there a certain?
Well, we don't go that far in the report, but I certainly believe that if you can get to that point, you can more closely monitor the outcomes against some particular measure. But we didn't get to that point in the report because we don't know what that number ought to be. But I think it's worth a continued conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Huff. Now we go to Ms. Strauss.
Thank you very much. This was a much needed and extremely interesting report. And I very much appreciate the research questions and the care with which you answered them, and the data and how it was collected. And again, making sure that we understand causality or not, so that we are interpreting the data appropriately. Long-term trends, I think, is excellent. Clearly, the changes that we've made in the SR&R are bearing fruit, and we are seeing places where we wanted to go, and I think that's clearly very important. I also see a sort of parallel trend lines in sort of what parents want, what teachers want, and just sort of larger national trend lines in how we look at discipline and the emphasis on keeping kids in school and not having disruptions in instruction. So I think all of this is really very good news. I'm also, in sort of a couple of questions I have, and I'll sort of ask all the questions and we can go back to whether I can answer them. One is, I clearly see when the state first invented the sort of school report card, safety report card, the first year that was put out, we all panicked, and it was sort of like a huge data dump. And then there was a lot of clarification as to what was to be reported. So I'm assuming that Commonwealth of Virginia, we now are kind of on the same page on what the state is requiring for reporting of safe schools. So, and I'm seeing Dr. Carter shake his head. So, because that has changed in how these graphs look. I am concerned about recidivism, and I would like to go back to Ms. Scanlon and to look at that one a little bit more as to why, or are we just sort of beginning to see sort of normalcy in what we would expect with regard to our consequences? I'm also assuming that in some of this data change, when we went from long-term suspend rather than expulsion, that has a dramatic impact. then in how we report, because if we are suspending a student for 300 days in effect, I mean, because that's kind of what we're seeing is a lot more. You will be suspended for X number of days rather than outright expulsion, which then that's a change in how we respond, and that's okay. Clearly, students feeling safe at school is great. It's an excellent trend line. And what's interesting is that that is not declining. I would like a little more information over time on the gang task force, because I know a lot of us in sort of broader community stuff, we are beginning to see some concern in what we are hearing with the Board of Supervisors, and as we look holistically at the county, whether or not we just need to make sure that the county and the schools are all working together in community issues, as we've been with the Board of Supervisors looking at their lobs. And clearly, as the community responds to any kind of gang activity that spills over, potentially can spill over, as we are attempting to try to help all of our children. The issue, then I would like a little more discussion on mental health issues. And I know that we've talked about making sure that we are seeing continued instruction, and obviously there's a disproportionality in students with disabilities. And I guess my one question back, we know that children who would be ED, mentally ill, OHI, that whole spectrum, that for many of those children, when we get to March, April, May, they're exhausted. And it's just part of what comes with their challenges in life. So that when we are making decisions as to how to help these children, that the knee jerk is not, well, we're going to suspend you, but that we know some of these children need time and less stress, what have you. And I don't know how we respond to that. That's a whole different piece. Part of it comes back to, I know, the acknowledgement of targeted training, so that substitute teachers have that training. Obviously, all folks in a school, particularly in schools where we have our more fragile students. And I don't know how we respond to that, but I suspect that also shows up in the disproportionality to some extent. And I guess, Marianne, if you could respond to that one first, and then I do want to go back and Dana, if you can talk a little bit more on disproportionality. And there's not a whole lot we can do with the whole issue of mental health issues, not enough psychiatrists out there, insurance problems. I mean, those are the big issues, and that's bigger than any of us that we know as a county and as a nation we continue to deal with. But let's go back, Marianne, the exhaustion of our children
The
with mental
exhaustion
illness.
factor and the exhaustion of our teachers sometimes.
Right.
Come spring. Certainly we know in the world of alternative school programs that kids get squirrely in the spring. And you know, you all were getting the emails from the police or whomever over the last few weekends, and I don't think that that's directly related to mental health kind of things necessarily, but
No.
they do have our programs kind of looking, saying, okay, get ready, because this is going to be coming. And as you said, with the gang-related activities, sometimes we have to be cautious about how we then place those kids. I think that there is certainly an awareness with our community partners, with the youth that we've been working with, around the springtime being a more stressful sort of a period of time. And as you said, just for some of the kids with the more significant emotional disabilities, they've just tried so hard for so long that they're just kind of tired. So that is the time you will see most of the stress less kind of weeks. Just schools working in a preventative way to try to reduce a little bit the stress that's going across all of the youth, but particularly in your Cedar, Quander, Burke sort of facilities. There's not a whole lot you can do. I shouldn't say there's not a whole lot you can do. There have definitely been, we've worked with SROs, we've worked with the police force, the whole diversion first that the police force is getting trained in is helping to some extent with, is this a mental health crisis or is this a disciplinary situation? At the same time, we've had, again, in that other category are things like threats. We've had some individuals who quite potentially, due to their mental illness, have made some frightening threats that they had the capacity to fulfill. And so we have to constantly balance that safety concern. But, in my world, I'd love as many psychologists and social workers and counselors as we could possibly get. And I think that we would reduce things even more. But I also know the realities of budget and where we are.
Right, and I guess part of the issue is that sometimes for these youngsters that are just, they've mentally had it, homebound instruction, giving that relief is, for at least a handful of children, that saves them and keeps them out of an even deeper end of the pool. And I just
And there have
worry about
been,
that.
we have had more voluntary placements in the alternative
Exactly.
schools than we have had historically. And some of them have been genuinely voluntary. The child begins not to come to school,
Right.
counselors reach out and say, what's going on? There is an alternative. And other cases, the smaller kinds of offenses are building up, and a conversation is held with the parents to say, there are alternatives. We don't have to, kind of have your kid in this high numbers, high just pressure from the standpoint of the noise and a typical high school generates. And so we are getting more youth in. Usually right around now, we begin to say we can't take any more voluntary because we're anticipating through the hearings office group
Right, and that's
coming
because
in.
that's
We have to
exactly
sort of hold spaces open.
right, and that's kind of when some of those children so badly need, less stress.
And, on a case-by-case basis, we will always look at it.
Okay, and Ms. Ganlon, the recidivism, I'd love to know a little bit more about that. Where are we?
Well, I think that recidivism is a topic, as well as disproportionality, that you could make your own report on each of those two issues. With recidivism, you have to look at how we're defining recidivism. I know for the purposes of this report, they defined recidivism by looking at the same school year. You've gotten in trouble once, you received some consequence. It was either a referral to the hearings office, a suspension, or something lesser. What was the recidivism rate for each of those three consequences and the chance that you would commit an offense in the same school year? So by defining recidivism in that way, what you're seeing is that overall, a referral to the hearings office yields the lesser chance of seeing that student get in trouble again the same year with a reportable offense. In the middle, you have an out-of-school suspension. And the most recidivism is with those lesser offenses. That's one way to look at the topic. I know in my annual report that you received, I believe in January or February, we define recidivism differently. We look at, of all of the cases we handled, how many of those kids had we seen before? So when you look at my annual report, you would see that in the last school year, our recidivism ticked up, that we were seeing more repeat visitors to our office than we had in the prior year. For us, it goes up and down, it goes up and down. I think that if you isolate what you're really interested in knowing, again, you could make a whole report. Do we see, for my office, for example, and I'm throwing these out there as questions, it's not something I've looked at, but I certainly could. Do we see more or less recidivism when a student benefits from an expedited review? I don't know. It's something we can look at. Do we see more or less recidivism when students are permitted to return to their school? Do we see more or less recidivism when students are assigned to particular kinds of alternative settings? Those are all questions, I think, that are worthy of examination.
Thank you, and I would ask that we need to keep our eye on disproportionality as well as recidivism so that we know that when we do have to have a consequence, does that actually improve that particular student's behavior? So over time, but anyway, great report. Trend line absolutely in the directions we want to go.
If I
But-
could clarify, though, one issue on the expulsions,
Right.
where you
Oh,
saw
right.
that huge decrease in the
Right,
number of
exactly.
students expelled. It's not that students are being long-term suspended at greater rates. We really, as a county, have never employed the long-term suspension until late in the spring. So, for example, in the hearings office, we don't long-term suspend until June, and that's simply a function of it makes no sense to reassign a student in June. What drove that sharp decrease, quite frankly, was especially in the last 2 years, is if you've been on the board for some time, you might remember the old letters of agreement and the tradition in Fairfax County to expel with services. So you were expelled, your record would show an expulsion, but you were permitted to attend an alternative program during the term of that expulsion. In the last 2 years, Dr. Garza made the decision to say, hey, if we're going to serve them anyway, why expel them? And so what's really drove that is we don't do those letter of agreements anymore. If we're expelling now in Fairfax County, we are really expelling.
with
It's
no
a no services situation. So where you see the 131 down to 2, in the 131, there were 11 kids expelled with no services. The rest were expulsions with services, and we've gradually brought those down until now we're not doing expulsions with services at all anymore. We're simply reassigning.
Great, thank you. That explains that very much. Great, appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. We technically are scheduled for another 10 minutes on this one, but I still have Elizabeth, Il Young, Ben, Karen Corbett Sanders, Tom, and myself. So I would just ask everybody to be judicious with their time. But on the other hand, this is a topic I think we need to be very mindful of. So let's go with Elizabeth and Il Young. You're on deck.
So glad you waited to say that right before I actually have a whole slew of questions. So I appreciate those last set of comments because some of what I wondered as this was being presented were things like, what are the time of year differentials? And has that changed? What are the school or pyramid idiosyncrasies? And has that changed? Or do you have effectively a heat map where we could be more proactive now that we're down to some bona fide data? Most significantly, the one thing that disappoints me that's not here is boys versus girls. And coming into this exactly about 6.5 years ago and doing, as everybody knows, I love data, a deep dive on data. It's boys between 7th and 10th grade, it's boys between 7th and 10th grade who are minorities, and it's boys between 7th and 10th grade who are students with disabilities. That's it. I mean, that is where, if you took a slice through this and presented that information, I would bet, I'd sign it, I'd bet north of 80%, maybe 90% of the discipline cases fall within those parameters. And so we know where they're going to crop up. And my question is, are they still cropping up in that same area? And what can be done with effectively maybe the RAMP programs that we've now instituted that can effectively, be early warning detection systems to be early diversionary options for these kids. The other big thing is on the statistic where, and you went fast, but the involuntary transfers, I believe you said they went from 92% down to 62%. Is that about right? We don't have to get exact, but so my question would remain, how many of those are first-time offenders for possession or use of something that would qualify as a misdemeanor under Virginia law. And the reason I ask that is the nuance of what is really a first chance, diversionary program for, and are we splitting hairs between use versus possession because that's how we feel, and making a data-driven decision of, did that go from 92 to 62? Could that go from 92 to 12? And the big question, could we bring up slide 25, please? And whether you say we're providing services, not providing services, the bottom line is that this type of a graph, to me, should be monetized. Because there is a way for us to talk about not what things cost, but what they save. And when you turn over, a half a decade, your practice, and it wasn't just Dr. Garza, it was the previous board, with a tremendous amount of effort with the community and a task force and a lot of dialogue and a lot of passion by some people on the board. When you create that, you create a way to repurpose, at least. If you haven't just outright saved money, you've created a purpose for money that was spent at 6,000 out-of-school suspensions, and now you're able to, put the money into proactive diversionary programs up front, so that goes even precipitously down more. So that is a big slide to me. That's a big takeaway. But I think that if we can start talking about, and it isn't crass, 6,000 out-of-school suspensions costs a school system a lot of money. 2,600 costs a lot less. So let's talk about the wise use of resources. Can we go to slide 19, please? Yeah, no. Oh, it is slide 19. Oh, I have my notes separate. No, I want to go back to the one where they feel safe. It's the 3 columns. Yes, this one. A correlation of this, and somebody started to bring it up, between, 90+% feel safe. What does the working conditions study show for the schools? Like, the safer the kids feel, are they behaving better, or does that just make, have we, and to be fair to the employees in the building, have you gone too far? And that's all well and good. We've had a precipitous drop in, transfers or whatever, but now have we strung out teachers so much because we're keeping the wrong kids in the school? And I think that's that balance, maybe, that you were talking about, Marianne, of how do we compare this in context with how's the staff feeling? And I do think juxtaposing that would be helpful. I'm not suggesting that we do it now, but I'm hoping this report becomes an annual report, or even actually a semi-annual report. I mean, it wouldn't need to be as comprehensive because now we have something in context. I mean, this is a report I was looking for 5 years ago, so I'm thrilled. I'm sorry, I know, but this is very, very important. Proportionality. A CDC report just came out on fatherlessness in America, and I know this is not popular, but this is one of those courageous conversations. But 16.9% of Asian students are fatherless. 72.3% of Black students are fatherless. Well, I'm not having a biology class with you, Mr. Moon. 35 living in a fatherless home, 35.7% white, 65.8% American Indian and Alaskan. So if we have 1% of our kids in a discipline issue that are Asian and we're proclaiming disproportionality at 4% are Black, well, 4% times 16.9% fatherlessness takes you to 67%. You know, there are other issues that we're not going to be able to solve that fall outside the walls of our schools. So I want to be careful that we try to suppress, you know, disproportionality without taking into context the full spectrum of issues which are out of the school's control. And there's some things that we may never get completely proportional because of those things that are outside of our context. And those are the numbers from CDC. Last 2 points I'd like to make, slide 38. I'm sorry, this is too important. This is 6 years. Slide 38, on the expulsions, I think it was our comparison. Yes, but can we go to the comparison to us in, Virginia and the nation? The black bar and the red triangle or whatever it is. This one. Is it the same definition? Is this is the thing I wonder. Receiving out of school suspensions. Is it for the same things, for the same ethnicities, for the same disabilities? So are we comparing apples to apples here to Virginia and to the nation? They're looking at the exact same things.
Our understanding is, yes, this was all pulled from one data source, and we assume they did it the same way because they have a specific reporting criteria. So our understanding is, yes, it's the same.
But does everybody else have an out-of-school suspension for the same reason?
No, from state to state, why you get suspended would vary.
Yeah, see,
so the national average would include lots of different reasons, but that's why we also put in Virginia and school divisions.
Of everything, I don't like this slide because I don't trust that what we're saying is an out-of-school suspension and what it's for and how long it's for has anything to do that there's a necessary corollary. I do think that there's a lot of assumptions here. So that would be my point going forward. My last question is, where is the data? Do we have it? And this is the next step that I'd actually like to see is where's the data on how many of these discipline incidents are camera caught and enforced? How many relate to the security cameras? Well, I think we ought to know because we're talking about taking lots of capital pseudo-capital monies and putting them into schools under the auspices that we're making our schools safer so that we can catch and document the issues. And if we aren't documenting how many discipline infractions we're catching because of the amount of equipment we're putting in watching kids, which I have a huge issue about, and I know I am in the minority on this, but I have very serious concerns about teaching children who by law have to be in our buildings that the government can watch you, and when you make a mistake, they can catch you, and now they've got the evidence to prosecute you and punish you. So I think we need to be looking at how much information we're actually getting from these cameras versus does it feel good to have them in our buildings to create a safer building? Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. I now move on to Mr. Moon, followed by Ben Press, followed by Karen Corbett-Sanders.
I know that we are short of time.
Actually, Mr. Moon, I do want to clarify for everyone, we started 15 minutes later. So actually, we are still 15 minutes from our end time.
Additional 15 minutes. I'll just add that to my time then. And if I'm not still, then I'll send in questions. I have a whole lot of questions. Okay, I'm going to start with an easier one first. If you look at slide number 29, right there, you're talking about disproportionality, just comparing Asian versus Black, since they're right next to each other. We say that that's 4 times as high. And then you bring that, this is year 2011 and 2012. Granted that this is just for out-of-school suspensions. If you bring it to 32, slide number 32, 2011 and 2012. I'll just compare between Asians and Black. Asians is 0.4 and Black is 3.3. That looks like it's 8 times as high. Granted that that includes not only the suspensions but also referral to hearings office. Am I just seeing the slides wrong, or the first slides I saw, 29, when you had 1% for Asians, that's not really 1%. It's less than 1% that was rounded up.
Okay, two things around it. One is the definition that is used in the first slide, and the data that comes from is slightly different than the data that we have ourselves. So that makes
If you could send me the explanation,
may have
clarification
some
of those,
separate ones.
because when I look at those slides together, just
Okay.
there was inconsistency. I
Okay.
noticed that. On disproportionality, by the way, before I get to that, my main focus on looking at this SRNR, all this data, thank you for a lot of data. It was so much for me to consume, but I enjoyed looking at this. What I'm interested in is overall maintaining safety and orderliness in schools and classrooms while improving behaviors of our students, minimizing obviously instruction in loss of instructional time for students who are going through this discipline process. All these numbers we saw in the data, suspension, number of students who are suspended might have gone down. But the true question is whether behaviors have improved as well, or they are simply not being suspended or not being reported. I remember having this discussion, heated debate, close to 20 years ago, when we began, having a target goals for the school system to reduce the number of suspension and etc. Contention was, so now are you going to start requiring our teachers, administrators simply close their eyes, not to do anything for certain behaviors, because now our goal is to reduce? I hope that's not the case. We're going to find ways to improve the behaviors, and if there is a lack of understanding by adequate understanding by teachers and administrators, looking at certain behaviors exhibited by students, and if that requires cultural competency training or diversity training, some other additional resources provided, maybe that's what we should do. But so where are we in all of this? Because that is something, I don't know whether that requires closed meeting discussion, but whether you can even require that disproportionality to be reduced as a goal for the school system. Whether that can be done, or they will require just a burden upon teachers and administrators to disregard certain behaviors. That's the conversation I think we need to have. As I said, I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll send in those questions. And I worry about, long ago we had in-school suspensions, we have a timeout rooms, and which required a lot of resources, so that we minimize sending kids, keeping students at home for certain behaviors. We need to engage them, give them, instruction rather than keeping them in school. They require resources, and at one point that went away because we are under financial stress, couldn't afford to do that. Your presentation showed the school administrators asking for more additional staff support. Dr. Soccer seems to be stating that we have not done really study to the academic benefit of additional staffing we are providing. Isn't this the first year we are providing SOSA? And just the second year. How many years do you think of data do we need to have before we can have some sort of analysis and study results to present it to the board, the impact, the effect of this SOSA on whatever that we are looking at, whether it's behavior issues or it's academic benefit issues? Because again, school administrators want more support. Dr. Sakur's office is not ready to provide analytical support for that. So as a board member who has to make budgetary decisions, when will we be prepared to make those decisions as a board?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be answered today, but I'll send in the rest of my questions in writing to you.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. I do want to point out Chairman Hines already followed that method, and I really appreciate it. She copied all of us so we could see the questions she's submitting to staff in relation to this study, and I would encourage all of us to do the same. We'll still walk through next steps, but I think this has generated a lot of questions. And then Mr. Smith, obviously you, Dr. Sockwell, working with Dr. Garza and Dr. Lockhart, as you look through those, if you need to pare them down, streamline them or whatever, I'm sure you can work with Chairman Hines and Ms. Evans on that. So now we move on to Ben, followed by Karen Corbett Sanders, and then rounding up with Tom and myself.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated this presentation. One of the things that I've been following most closely outside of our school system, but in our community around the issue of mental health, has been the county's Diversion First program. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we as a school system can learn from that program. And it was a little kind of golden nugget of information that was included in this presentation that I think warrants a further discussion, maybe if not today, at another time, is the fact that in some cases, disciplinary intervention for some students is not going to be effective because the root of the problem is not that they've got, say, an attitude issue. It's that they've got substantial mental health problems that they're grappling with. Take, for example, the fact that we incorporated truancy and absenteeism in our other category for disciplinary infractions. If a student does not feel mentally well enough to come to school or has anxiety, or is too depressed to simply function in class, a disciplinary consequence of suspension or detention or whatever it might be is not effective for that student. What that student needs is mental health support. And we as a school system are, in my opinion, obligated to make sure that we're providing an environment where our students can come back and thrive. So my question around that is, number one, what is our framework for determining what students are placed in mental health intervention as opposed to disciplinary, other discipline avenues? I'll go through my questions and you can kind of respond afterwards if that's okay. Secondly, there was a lot of data in here about suspensions, and there was a really good trend line about median days of suspension and how many we're doing, and I think that's all really powerful information. What I will say I have noticed, and I don't know if this is just an individual experience informing this or if this is across the division, is an increase in the use of in-school suspension. I don't know if that, again, is a general trend line. It could be unique to the anecdotes that I've heard. But if we are using that substantially on a division-wide scale, how is that being incorporated into these data? Are we lumping it in with days of suspension, or are we putting that into another subgroup? And third, the data was very interesting when we were looking at the other group on slide 17 and then again on slide 18. We notice a spike right around 2005 to 6 to 2006 and 7. It triples. I don't, in my hypothesis. I'm not hypothesizing that that's because there were 3 times as many offenses occurring. So I was going to ask if there was perhaps a change in the reporting framework or if it was different guidelines around that, because I think that warrants further explanation so that if community members are watching this, they can understand that our students didn't get 3 times as rowdy over that year.
Mr. Press, you've been paying attention. I absolutely think your hypothesis is correct. What happened was in the summer of 2005, there was an effort in Fairfax County to ensure consistency in discipline reporting. That was right around the time when the state report cards were causing a lot of concern, and there was a misunderstanding among school administrators, well, that if I put all of these things into what was then SASE, is now SIS, then our state report card is going to be a mess. So what we were seeing was a lot of inconsistency, particularly at the elementary and middle school levels. So a mandatory training for all school-based administrators was conducted in the summer of 2005, where the expectation coming forward from Dr. Dale was if a student is being disciplined by a school administrator, the expectation is that it will be put into SASE, that it will be recorded so that we have good internal consistent data countywide. And we also explained that that doesn't then translate into your school report card because of reporting requirements. So I think you're absolutely correct. We don't see a spike in offenses. We see a spike in the accurate reporting or recording of the offenses that were occurring.
And to quickly answer your mental health versus a discipline response, over time, the number of things that have fallen under the discretion of the principal, particularly around not having mandatory suspensions for anything at this point, has had the intent of allowing a principal to make that kind of a differentiated decision. Sometimes it will be, you have to also take into factors like how many other issues has this individual had, and sometimes I think there is an element of, we've sort of exhausted the resources that we have here available for this youth, and not every youth who is experiencing a mental health concern will necessarily be a special education student. So in some cases, if they were a special education student, then one might say, let's pull the IP team back together again. But for some kids, particularly kids with depression, they may not be eligible for special education, but it may still be a factor. I think that there is definitely, again, a trend. I don't know how to quantify it, but I do believe that there is a trend towards trying to intervene, especially if in the conversation with the parent about the disciplinary concern, it comes out that the youth has been in therapy, has been in the hospital recently, has been many things that the parent had not previously chosen to share with the school, then that may divert. And then you will recall that last year it was added that the IP team be consulted if there were a situation that would result in a suspension. So I think all of those things together are moving us in that direction. We're not where we'd love to be, but we're moving in that direction.
Anything else, Mr. Bress?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, moving on to Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Mr. Wilson, and then myself.
Great, thank you. I had sent some questions over the weekend, which I will send to the whole board, but those questions really were driven in a couple of different areas, one of which is that as we have 25% decrease in cases going to the hearings office, and we have expulsions down to 20% of what they used to be, and we have referrals actually down by or suspensions down by half. There are cost savings associated with that, and the question is, have we reallocated those resources to the schools which are taking a a higher percentage of the work or have a higher burden for the work to be done. So I would like to understand that a bit more. I too had expressed some questions about gang prevention and awareness, and when we start focusing on that in our schools, so that we obviously want to decrease any evidence or incidences of it. And was intrigued by the concept of a video explaining the SR&R to our students and whether that might be a useful tool, especially for some of our underrepresented populations, for their parents to understand what our SR&R is all about, as well as questions regarding the although we have a decrease in alcohol, tobacco, and drugs, we have had increases in the incidences of both assaults and weapons violations, and was wondering whether we were double counting in some areas, as well as I would welcome an unpacking of the other category to have a little bit more data, because it seems like we've got apples, oranges, and kiwis in there. And so if we can unpack that, that would be very helpful. As well as in looking at the data, we have ethnic breakout. It would also be helpful to have a breakout as to FRM data. And whether there is linkage there. And I noticed that you unpack the data for our high schools, but are not doing it for our middle schools and elementary schools. I think that would be helpful to know, as well as looking at it from a recidivism from students going from elementary school to middle school to high school. So is there something we can be doing to have earlier intervention at the elementary school level, perhaps through our family life education, through some intervention programs, so that we don't actually have the same level of incidences at the middle and high school level? And that's it. Thank you.
I can give you the quick answers. Yes, we do have the data disaggregated, at least for the last 3 years, for elementary, middle, and high. It was just most of the suspensions and most of the referrals to the hearings office will come from high, and that was part of the reason that for this report they focused there. But we have the data across the board. In terms of the video, it is produced in English. It is subtitled in Spanish. And it has been posted and been available to parents all along. I'd have to check whether this year's was, but it has been posted since we made it. So I believe it's there.
Some of our parents may not be able to read the subtitles, but they can understand it if it's spoken.
So we can look into that, certainly.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. I now call on Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this report. I really am going to try to keep this as brief as possible, because I think most people have hit on the concerns that I would have raised or the questions I've raised. But in general, I think one of the sort of collective comments really concerns it's a ton of data. What does this data really mean for the board? People have mentioned, did it result in changes in behavior or just changes in reporting? Is there differences in changes in law in the state of Virginia on reportable offenses? What's the comparison across the comparison states? And what's the breakout of data across different groups within Fairfax County Public Schools? So I think those are all really ways that we could understand the data presented here in even a more in-depth way. And so I appreciate all of my colleagues' efforts to sort of raise all of those various points, because I think we have to be pretty careful in terms of understanding data that we have regarding discipline. I wanted to go back to the very first thing that you mentioned, which was that this isn't really a program evaluation. This is really a monitoring report of discipline over time within Fairfax County Public Schools, and I think it bears. I guess because it's a different sort of report. It's it's not an evaluation per se of a particular program. I wonder whether I could put our Office of Auditor General on the spot and just get her insight into how we might understand this sort of report and what we might, as a board, collectively think about in terms of how we would like the office to go back and refine some of the information in here. But you got to promise to keep it very brief.
Thank you. I think I would go a step further and report providing data. But the intent of the report was not to do any cause and effect, and that was made very clear by the Office of Program Evaluation. And I think all the questions that the board members have asked are very salient. What were the root causes? What else can we find out? And taking a step back, what are the goals we hope to achieve across the board? Those are some of the questions. The Office of Auditor General wouldn't necessarily look at this report and determine that there'd be additional steps we could do as a result of the report, but we could definitely look at risks around discipline programs if it pleases the board. But we have some avenues or opportunities to do that through the audit plan. But so from the perspective of this report itself, I didn't see this as a monitoring report, but it definitely is a good first step in collecting data and the evolution of data, because in order to monitor, you want to have performance-driven data and measurable outcomes and outputs. So I don't think I'm saying anything that the board doesn't already know. So I'll leave it with that. Does that answer your question, Mr. Wilson?
It does. I really just wanted to give you a chance to give your insights for the benefit of the board.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Let's see. A lot of questions have been raised, but I have some things I want to point out. And I'm just going to go in order of where the slides are as opposed to, what might be. So I'm going to start with slide 18. This goes to something that Mr. Press raised. If you look at, and Ms. Scanlon started to answer it. So you look in 2005-06, the other category went from a little over 3,300 to suddenly 9,300 to 12,700, and then starts to go back down again. And I think that is one where I would have wanted to have a better understanding. And Ms. Scanlon, I think what I was hearing you say is that it had something to do with us being more accurate in what we reported to the state. But I'm trying to figure out, all of a sudden, how do we suddenly have a 3 to a 4-fold increase in other incidences happening and reported violations? Is this just suddenly we decide? I do remember when Dr. Dale talked about this before I even joined the board. At one point, it was kids getting caught with gum. What happened here that this? Because I think those numbers have to be explained. So
I can try to answer that. And again, it's my hypothesis. I can't say for certain how much of what you see in that increase is attributable to the expectations in the recording of the data. It wasn't related in what was sent to VDOE. So we're not talking about what's reported to VDOE, because what is reported to VDOE is, quite frankly, a pretty small subset of the data that you would see entered into SIS every day. Incidents only get reported to VDOE if there is an expulsion, an out-of-school suspension, or if it's what VDOE would categorize as a serious offense. In that other category, while there can be some very serious misconduct in the other category, gang activity, arson, robbery, threats, for the most part, the other category is, in terms of VDOE reporting, information VDOE would categorize as less serious. Therefore, it doesn't get reported to VDOE at all unless there's a suspension attached to it. But in any case, what we were seeing prior to 2004 is that you had a certain number of offenses that occurred in any given year. They weren't being put into the computer system at all in a lot of cases, particularly at the elementary and middle school levels. So the students would come to the office, they would get some kind of consequence, but the information wasn't being recorded at all. There was a big push in 2005 to say, look, if a kid comes to the office and the administrator is meting out some kind of discipline, it needs to be recorded in the system.
So the chart specifically says number of VDOE reported violations. So in effect, isn't this chart showing that they're looking at exactly what you've described? It was a VDOE reported violation. So in other words, something did go on dramatically for about 3 school years, and then they started to come back down again, but we're not even, where we are, even in 2014-15, to where we've been in a decade earlier.
And some of the offenses that weren't, in my hypothesis, that weren't be putting into the system, there are offenses, for example, if you have a cigarette at school, that is an offense that likely you're not going to get suspended for. You may get a warning, you may get a phone call home, but you're not going to get a suspension. That is on the category that VDOE would consider serious, such that it would be reported to VDOE.
So therein lies, I think, what you're trying to explain is we weren't necessarily treating it as a serious offense, but VDOE said we need to record that this occurred, and that's what you started to see. In terms of slide number 30, I wanted to say to my colleagues, I thought this was probably the most salient data chart for all of us to be looking at, because if you compare us to even the surrounding jurisdictions right here in Prince William, Loudoun, and Arlington, and look at all of our numbers, even though we are not comfortable with where our disproportionality is. I really studied this and looked at it, and I know Ms. Schultz, you talked about, well, maybe they're coding it differently. But in my mind, if we as a board wanted to have a dialogue with Dr. Garza to say, if we really want to delve a little bit deeper in understanding where we are compared to our surrounding jurisdictions here. I mean, right now, just the numbers alone show that we are really dramatically different in terms of lower incidences overall of the out-of-school suspensions and the percentages in terms it impacts the different subgroups. So I think this one would have a lot to tell us. And I'll formulate a question and make sure I submit to staff. But I would also just say I think this chart would benefit from having the date 2011-12 added to it, just so people know, because it goes to the prior data table with the whiskers and whatever you call them, box and whiskers. Thank you. Slide 34. This one also, again, goes to the question of disproportionality. And I wanted to say to my colleagues, one could look at this data chart and say it's some of the most encouraging news we see, and then it could also be some of the most disconcerting news. Encouraging in the sense that if you look across the 3 years, you will see that for the 4 subgroups, you see a decline going down, except unfortunately not for Hispanics. But for whites, African Americans, and Asians, you do see a drop. And then in terms of students with disabilities, you also see a 3-year decline. However, in terms of what's disconcerting, when you do the percentages of the subgroups for what percentage they make up of our general population versus their representation, it is concerning. Especially, my colleagues, I want to point out students with disabilities. I believe they make about 14% of our student population. People nodding yes. And yet, if you look at the numbers, they are almost what that would mean if they were proportional to their population is in 2012, students with disabilities would have been 388 cases, not almost 1,100. And even in 2014, students with disabilities, you would have seen 282 cases, not 800. So there's still almost 3 to 4 times the number of representation. So I just think that is additional data that we really should want to better understand, because I do think this can drive policy and practice. Ms. Schultz and several of us have always talked about, our special hearings we have on the causality, the MDRs. I mean, some of us have wondered if the MDRs are, and I know those also have some state implications, but I think our MDRs play a role in this. The other thing is, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, thank you very much for bringing up about our free and reduced lunch population in terms of looking at some data points, because we know that economic instability can also create additional challenges and crises for our students. And so I think it would be helpful that rather we focus on subgroups by race, but we should be looking at also, I think, our poverty numbers and to see what that tells us as well. In terms of slide 39, I just wanted to really thank Ms. Schultz for spotlighting something that to me was very important when we did the review with staff prior to today's presentation. This has to do with benchmarking. It has to do with what our Auditor General, Ms. Trump, was talking about. You have to have benchmarks, but you also have to then have, how do you then set your targets and goals? So on the one hand, I think every person in this room is thrilled to see that in terms of the percent of students who are returning back to their school after a hearings office, it's gone from 5% to 38%. But as Ms. Schultz pointed out, that still means 62% of the students who find themselves going through a hearings office are not going back to their school. They are being transferred somewhere for a period of time. And I think we are pleased, Ms. Scanlon, we've seen that sometimes that transfer length has been shortened. It's not a full year, and that isn't necessarily captured in this report. And I think it's something we would want to be taking note of. But without benchmarking and educational best practice, we don't know that 62% still being transferred is okay. I mean, that could still be compared to what we know the research says. It's still, we've come a good way, but we could be still 2/3 of where we should be. So that, to me, was one of the slides where I would, say we need more additional information. And Ms. Corbett-Sanders, did you have a question to that?
What I would suggest is looking at it a little bit differently. You have a decrease in numbers being referred to the hearings office by 20% of what used to be referred. And then you have an increase of how many of those students are actually being referred back to the school. So, or being sent back to their base school. So I would actually combine those two metrics to see what the real number is today versus what it was when you started collecting the data in 2009. You see what I'm saying? Is that if the 38% is 38% times 5 times of that, because 5 times there's 1/5 of a likelihood that they'll ever get to the hearings office. You see what I'm saying? You've decreased their probability of actually getting to the hearings office.
Right.
And you've increased their probability of actually going back to their base school. So you need to take those two metrics into account when you're looking at this.
Dr. Sockwell, did you want to comment on what Ms. Corbett-Sanders is saying, or is this going to be better off if I think you posed the question and then maybe we can add this to the list, because I think there's some mental gymnastics going on with this. Mr. Moon?
But I had, before you adjourn this work
okay,
session,
you have a quick
I
go
have a
back.
quick go
Okay. And then the other thing I just wanted to say about this report that I think is so important is staff led by Dr. Sockwell was very, very careful in what conclusions they were drawing. And I want to caution everyone at this table to not start drawing conclusions here. For example, when we talk about recidivism rates, we talk about what was the recidivism rate when they came out of the hearings office? What was the recidivism rate if they were out of school suspension or if they weren't suspended? We're not talking apples to apples offenses. So I think that, again, if you want to benchmark recidivism rates that maybe we see for similar offenses in other school districts who used different approaches, that might be one thing. But I think we have to be very careful in terms of that it could end up looking that. So if we really want to curb recidivism, just send them all through the hearings office, and then that way we can have a lower incidence of them repeat offending. I also want to thank Ms. Scanlon for pointing out that how you define recidivism versus maybe how it was defined in this study. For me, I mentally made the note that, so we're thinking within a calendar year of the offense, not within the school year, because if you committed the offense in May, your chance of recidivism is going to be much lower than if you committed the offense in September of the start of the school year. So anyway, those are kind of the big picture things. And I would say, Dr. Lockhart, the challenge that you and Mr. Smith have today is, since Dr. Garza's not here, we just unloaded a whole lot of thoughts, questions. But I think maybe it goes to what Ms. Schultz said, and I do have a go back from Mr. Moon and then from Ms. Schultz, is that I think clearly what this study has done is it's piqued the board's interest in saying we're very pleased with the direction we've been going with discipline. But if we're going to be very thoughtful and very intentional in the continued work we do, including recommendations that may come from Marian Panarelli and Dr. Garza with any SR&R changes and practices, we're going to have to make sure that policy and practice changes are informed by what we know the data says where it's been effective, and perhaps, again, the benchmarking and from other school divisions. So there are some real implications. Professional development based on what? Based on other school divisions where they've seen success in their practices, and we want to develop more of that. So I will say, again, in absence of Dr. Garza being here, Dr. Lockhart, please tell her I think everyone is very encouraged by what we saw here today. And in my mind, it only emphasizes this board's commitment to continuously improve what we see here to get even better than we are. So with that, Mr. Moon, and then Ms. Schultz.
Just a quick comment on the number of offenses reported to VDOE that going up from 3,000 to 9,000 from year 2005, 2006 school year to 2006 and 2007. As you go back and try to find out exactly what caused that, even though my memory is fading, I sort of recollect there having been something different coming from State Board of Education as well at that time frame. I just Googled that, and that State Board of Education's Student Conduct Policy Guidelines, which was initially developed in 1994, had a major revision adopted in September 2004. That's a 2005 school year. And so see whether that had an effect upon reporting requirements. And that might have caused, that's a sort of my recollection at the time, from that time frame. It's a both from within and without.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. Ms. Schultz?
Just a quick clarification. We keep talking about I had brought up the time of year, and Ms. McLaughlin a little bit got to it. Part of the reason I ask about time of year is not just the end of year and that the recidivism might not be as great or the length of suspension might not be as long. The other time of year question is things around quarter end. You know, are kids under pressure at quarter end or just after quarter end when they get their grades? Does that result in, you know, a spike or something like that? And that's why I ask about time of year, because if there's something that we're doing from a policy perspective with our calendar, with our quarters, with, you know, admins in the building. I'm sorry, I'm impaired by allergies. Then that would be informative, I think, for executive decision-making purposes.
Great. With that, Chairman Hines, I have a quick question for the board. We are running about 40 minutes behind between the two presentations. I think we lost 25 minutes on this one. So before we go to next steps, I wanted a quick show of hands. Do you all want me to shave lunch by 20 minutes or down to 20 minutes versus 30, or are you okay? Because I think we will make up time on the digital transformation and we could actually continue. But how do people feel about the break? Would you like to stick to the 30 minutes? Okay. All right, then I promise you we'll move the next one along. It was more generous with time, and I think this one ended up requiring a little additional focus. So Ms. Mulberg, do we have next steps? Okay, excellent. Colleagues, I am not going to read this out loud. So why don't you all look at it real quick? And then if you look at this, and then please let me know if there's anything that jumps off the page that's missing. And then again, please make sure anything you want to add, copy the full board so that we can see your questions and anticipate what may be coming. It also will prevent us from sending the same questions in. So for the key questions people were asking, do you see Ms. Strauss?
I just, this looks fine to me. I just have one question. It might be useful if the discipline office re-releases your latest report, because I think board members now being able to see that in context with this would probably be helpful, because some of the questions people were asking are actually in that report. So just send it out again.
So
Thanks.
if you could put that as a next step, just so we capture it, that the hearings office will send to the full board its most recent report.
And it's really a resend, because I think it came to us already this year, but since we have new board members, seeing it again with this, I think will help.
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. I very much agree. Anything else that people need? All right, colleagues, then we will start back at 1:45 sharp, and I appreciate everyone's investment in this session.
traditional education is really, really old. It's very antiquated. Our society doesn't fit into that package anymore. This type of traditional education doesn't meet the needs of the jobs that we have now or what we're going to have in the future.
Yeah, I think we've seen a huge shift in society because a lot of the jobs